Much to a hill of beans, but these are our hills and those are our beans. You know, when our problems come up, they're always big to us, right? When we face trouble, when we face problems, it's big to us, but it's hard to consider how a God of the universe could be so concerned about someone as insignificant as us. Tonight, as we continue our study through the books of the Bible, we are going to turn to a rather small book of the Bible, the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is the story of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. It tells the story that is set in the time of the judges. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, it tells us it was in the day when the judges governed. Now, the book of Ruth could have just been put in the book of Judges, but it wouldn't have fit, not because of the timetable, but because of the tone. We've been studying the book of Judges on Wednesday night, and I can tell you it's not usually upbeat material, right? The time of Judges is the time when Israel's going in this downward cycle. So a story of hope and redemption doesn't fit there, but yet it occurs during that time. And I think that's an important thing to consider. During the time of the judges, when the whole world seemed to be falling apart, when the people of God were moving farther from God, it tells a story about a woman who was in exile, a woman whose life fell apart, and a woman who found redemption. So let's talk about the story in main characters. The main character probably of the book of Ruth isn't her namesake Ruth, but rather Naomi. In Ruth chapter 1 and verse 2, it says, "There was a man by the name of Elimelech and his wife Naomi. They had 2 sons. And at some point in time, though they were Ephraimites of Bethlehem, they went to the land of Moab. During the time of the judges, we often see that these foreign armies would come in and take over. And these people sojourned to the land of Moab. We don't know why. We do know that there's some terrible famine later. There's some other incidences. Maybe they were looking to improve their life, but they end up in the land of Moab. And while there, their 2 sons marry 2 different women. And for about 10 years, they would live there. But during that time, Naomi's husband dies. And you can imagine that tragedy, losing her husband. But then it gets even worse in verse 5. Her 2 sons die. And she's left bereft of her 2 children and her husband. Now not only is she a stranger in a strange land, she's a widow in a strange land with no family to take care of her. And so then we see that she makes a decision. She hears that the Lord is providing food for his people back in her homeland, and she decides to return back there. The decision, though, will have consequences. You know, Naomi's life at this point has turned very sour. In fact, when she gets back to her homeland in verses 19 and 20, and the people see her and say, "Well, is that Naomi? We haven't seen her in years." She tells them, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara." Because Naomi meant pleasant, but Mara meant bitter. Why? Because she said, "For the Lord Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." See, Naomi's sojourning to the land of Moab has brought her nothing but misery. And when she comes back without either of her sons, without her husband. But she does come back with one other person. And that's Ruth, the second main character of the book. We saw earlier that Ruth was one of the 2 daughters-in-law of Naomi. She married one of those 2 sons. And when Naomi makes her decision to go back to her homeland, in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 8, she tells Naomi to her 2 daughter-in-laws, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house, that the Lord may deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant you that you would find rest, each in the household of her husband." She kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will surely return with you to your people." Her 2 daughter-in-laws do not want to abandon her. "We'll go back with you to your people." They don't have all that much left, but they would have more than Naomi did. But they want to stay with her. But Naomi is insistent. She tells them, "No, there's no reason for you to come back." She said, "I'm too old to have any more sons, and if I did, you'd have to wait a long time for them to be your husbands. There's no future there for you. There's no hope there for you. And it says of those two daughter-in-laws that one of them, Orpah, she heard this message, she kissed her mother-in-law, and she left. But it tells us that Ruth clung to her. Interesting fact, you want to know, the famous TV star Oprah Winfrey, her name was actually supposed to be Orpah, but they spelled it backwards on the birth certificate, so she became Oprah. So your book club could be the Orpah book club, I guess, but it's not. But she's not the one that's remembered. It's Ruth. Ruth is remembered because she clung to Naomi. And as much as Naomi said, I don't have anything for you, she said, no, I'll stay with you. And in one of the greatest lines in the Bible, the greatest speeches in the Bible, in Ruth chapter 1 and verses 16 through 17, she says, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do this to me and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. It's one of those great speeches, lines in all of the Bible, right? People use this in various different ways. I've heard it, used it at weddings and anniversaries. This complete dedication that she has. That's one of the most interesting things about this little book is how well written it is. I compare it to like a watch, like a fine watch. You can look at it from the outside and go, man, that's nice. But if you open it up and see how intricate and how everything's put together and how it works and functions, it's even more amazing. I mean, this little book is just 4 chapters, but if you study it from a literary perspective, if you study it from a storytelling perspective, it just does everything right, the way that it blends this story together to draw you into this narrative and all the things that are happening. And it has lines like this that they seal exactly what's going on here. Ruth will not abandon Naomi. Though she has no reason to stay, she's going to stick by her mother-in-law. A woman who's lost everything, who's bitter at God for what's happened to her. She still has Ruth. Ruth is so dedicated that when they get back to her land, she will go and glean the fields to take care of her mother-in-law. Which leads us to the third character in the story, Boaz. In Ruth chapter 2, in verses 4 through 6, we see that Ruth has been, before those verses, Ruth has been going to the fields and working there. And in verses 4 through 6, it says, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and the reapers said, may the Lord be with you. And he said to them, may the Lord bless you. And Boaz said to his servants who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant in charge of the reapers said, she is a young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. You see, the Israelites had a very interesting welfare program that was prescribed to them from the old law. If you had a field, if you were bringing in a harvest, you were told you can take everything but leave the corners, leave the sides. In other words, you don't go and take everything out of that. You don't pick off every fruit. You don't harvest every grain, but you leave that little excess. Why? Because if there's a poor and needy person, they can go and they can take that extra. For the farmer, it would just be a little bit more, but wouldn't be much to affect his. But to that person who's desperate, they could go and work and they could provide with that little bit that was left over. And that's exactly what Ruth is doing. Boaz notices her and he asks his servants, who is this woman? What's she doing out there? And they said, well, she's a Moabite that came back with Naomi. She's taking care of her. And Boaz is impressed. So he speaks to Ruth. In verse 11 he says to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has fully been reported to me. How you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and came to a people you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, whose wing you have come to seek refuge. Boaz is impressed by this woman and her dedication. She's out there working the fields for her mother-in-law. He knows she doesn't have to be there. But he looks and he's impressed. He goes to her and he says, you're showing something. You have sought the Lord, may the Lord bless you, whose wing you've come under to seek refuge. He tells the other workers, he said, make sure that you don't just isolate her. Have her come up. If she needs something to drink, have her come from our water. Let her be part of the group. In other words, he doesn't just say, well, she's out there, we got to deal with her. No, he makes sure that she's taken care of and not mistreated. When Ruth goes home, she tells her mother-in-law about it. Mother-in-law asks her about what she did that day in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 19. She said she met this man by the name of Boaz. And you can almost see the turn right there when Naomi's face perks up. She looks up and says, Boaz? He's one of our family. Verse 20, she says, may he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness from the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her again, this man is our relative. He is our close relative. This man that she just happened to meet, she says, is actually part of their lineage. And you can see her change. God hasn't maybe abandoned me. And Naomi sees an opportunity to play matchmaker. So she makes sure to tell Ruth to go and be with Boaz and to show interest in Boaz, because Boaz is one that could redeem her family and her land. You see, every Israelite family was given land in the promised land. But as they would move away and that land would be sold or be taken over, it would change and go back to other families. And now that Naomi and them have left, their family land now is on someone else's hands. But if another member of the family would come and redeem it, well, she could once again have a lineage and a hope in Israel. And so she plays matchmaker. And she has Ruth go into Boaz. In chapter 3, we see their courtship. And it's funny because when we read it, a lot of times people look at it and say, well, that sounds odd, right? She's going in and she's bearing her feet and they're the leaning forward. You think, well, that's weird. But if you know the customs and the habits of that day, it's kind of like a Hallmark movie, right? They all got the same plot, different characters, but they're all, it's that romance breaking out. That's exactly what's happening here. And Boaz realizes that this Naomi is interested in him, and he's certainly interested in her. In verse 11, he says, now my daughter, do not fear. I will do whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know you are a woman of excellence. Boy, he says to her, you're great. That term, that woman of excellence, is something that we see both applied to Naomi, to Boaz, in their courtship. Of course, that next line is not my favorite line. You say there's great lines in there. Maybe this is the worst line. And he says, now there is true that there's a closer relative. However, there is a closer relative than I. He's basically saying, I would love to marry you, but there's a relative closer you could marry, which throws us off, right? Well, this had to do with who would have the line of redemption. Once again, in the old law, there were certain rules and regulations when a family member was lost, when a son would die, when a brother would die, that other family member would be responsible for bringing in that widow and continuing in that line. And that's exactly what's playing here. But Boaz, being such a noble guy, says, well, I could take advantage of this situation, but I'm going to do it right. And so he makes sure to go back into town and to find the man who was actually the closer redeemer and see if if he will redeem her. And if not, Boaz wants the opportunity. And we see that in chapter 4 and verse 7. It says that they went in and they made this deal. And one of those interesting customs there, it says that this was the custom in former times as Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land. As any matter, a man removed his sandal and gave it to another. And this was the manner of attestation in Israel. Which I think we should bring back that custom, right? Because I'd love to see people coming out of the courthouse with one cowboy boot and one loafer on, right? Because, that guy made a deal, right? Well, I guess we have, we think about the way we exchange property and everything. It probably seemed weird to somebody else, but that's how they did it. And basically what Boaz is doing here is he wants to be with Ruth. But he's going to make sure to do it right. He's going to make sure to cross every T, dot every I in order to make this relationship work. And that's exactly what the book ends with. Their marriage, and now they have children. And it's a happy ending, right? And it's a great little love story. But why is it in the Bible? I mean, it's a good story, right? Everybody loves a good story, but what's the purpose of it? Why is it included in Scripture? There were probably hundreds of love stories that they could have wrote about. Why this one? Well, I think the answer comes in the very end of the book. In Ruth chapter 4, in verse 13, it says, "So Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And the woman said to Naomi, Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, that his name may be famous in Israel, that he may also be you a restorer of life and a sustainer of you in your old age, and your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid her on her lap, and she became his nurse. And the neighbor women gave a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi." You know, it's interesting. There are 2 books in the Bible that are named after women, Ruth and Esther, and both of them have the very same core message, what they're based on: the providence of God. In both books, we see a story that's told that almost is different than any other Bible story, because God is not directly involved. In fact, in Esther, we never even hear his name. In Ruth, we hear God mentioned, but we don't see a miracle. We don't see God's direct action, right? We just see events taking place. But we forget sometimes that's how God does his best work. You see, all these things that just happened to Ruth. She just happened to go to that field. Boaz just happened to see her. They went back at this time. You may sit there and go, well, it was all just coincidence. It all just came about. But yet there's an idea there that God was working. God was planning. And you can see that in the very last line when it says, "So they named him Obed, and he is the father of Jesse, the father of David." You see, this story, it's just some random couple, actually is the story about the greatest king that would come for Israel. But it doesn't start in a palace. It doesn't start it with kings and queens. It doesn't come about because of political maneuvering. It comes about because of just 2 ordinary people that God brings together, and through them creates one of the greatest names that would be said among God's people. We sometimes wonder, where is God when our problems come? Like Naomi, we may look at the struggles in our lives and think, God must hate me. We get bitter. We wonder, what's God doing? Why is this happening to me? Why are we going through these difficulties and this pain? They're in the middle of a famine. Her husband dies. Her sons die. She's left alone and abandoned. She goes back to her home, and people can barely even recognize her because so much has happened. But it doesn't mean that God isn't watching out for us. Jesus would tell us in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 26, "Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow, they do not reap, they do not gather in barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much worthy than they?" It doesn't amount to a hill of beans, but it does to God. If he cares for the sparrow, would he not care for us? We sometimes look at our world and look at things and we think, why is this all happening? Why does God allow this to happen? It comes to our own lives. We find our problems and they're devastating to us, right? No one else in this world may care about them, right? But it hurts us. We wonder, does God even care? But the book of Ruth tells us that God cares about us. That even when we're in the foreign land, even when we're in a different place, God cares about us. Even when it seems like He's abandoned us, when the struggles come and the pain is there, and we wonder, what's God doing? He still cares about us. And that the things that happen in our life that we can easily brush away as just coincidence, or we can easily just brush away and say, well, it's just one of those things that happen, may be something bigger. It may mean the providence of God. I think sometimes we make that mistake is when we read through the Scripture and we see these big, major acts of God. We see these miraculous deeds and we think, boy, that's when God is showing out. But maybe, just maybe, God is showing His greatest power when He does His most subtle things. When He puts us in the right place. When He does something that draws us closer to Him. You know, Paul would speak about this when he was making his great sermon in Acts chapter 17 and verses 26 and 27. When he talked about God who made one man of every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. He has determined and appointed their times and boundaries and their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they would grope for Him and find Him, for He is not far from each one of us. You see, God has put everything into order, and God has put it in His place, and nothing happens outside of the will of God. You know, we make decisions and we live our ways, and we have our choices, but yet God is still working even in spite of our bad choices and even with our good choices. It's interesting here because what we see with Boaz, and we see this effort of redemption, it does so because he's following what? The laws that God has put down, right? These ancient laws that people look at and say, well, why would God make these statements? Why would God put these things in order? Because He did it to preserve His people. That even one who had lost everything could come back home and find a redeemer and find redemption. And what Boaz does for Ruth, Boaz says, it's not me, it's God showing His way, right? That you have come under the wings and to seek His refuge. Boaz, as a man of God, recognizes that when he does good, he's doing it for God. It's interesting because Naomi's name means pleasant, right? But when she comes home, she tells people, don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara. Why? Because Mara means bitter. But by the end of the story, what is she again? She's Naomi. She's bouncing that boy on her knee. She's smiling the biggest smile you could ever imagine, right? People look at her and say, that's the woman we knew. Look at her. A son has been born to Naomi. Think about a proud grandparent. I don't know if there was ever one that was just as proud as Naomi was of that little boy on her knee. They named him Obed, which means one who serves. What do we see in this book? We see those who serve God. Those who put their hope and trust in God. That God cares about them. And God puts people in their lives and things in their lives in order to help them to grow, help them in their times of need. But it's when we go against the current of God, right, that things fall apart. It's interesting. Why? Because this book is in the book of Judges, when everybody is abandoning God and trying to do things their own way, and everybody's just doing what's right in their own eyes, that we have this story about people who are following God's plan, and we see what great comes of it. For David, the great king of Israel, would come of it. But also, from that lineage would come the King of Kings. Because from the line of David would come the ultimate Redeemer, Jesus. The story of Ruth tells us that God cares about us. And that even in our struggles and our weak moments, He is there for us. And He has placed a Redeemer for us to bring us back. Where could God be leading you today? Maybe today you find yourself lost, a stranger in a strange land. Maybe you find yourself today without a lot of hope. Let me tell you, there is one who can redeem you, one that if you'll come home to, he'll run to meet you. He'll be there for you. He has a plan for you, a way to be saved. And if you'll listen and follow his will, he can change everything. He can take you from bitter to pleasant. He can take you from lost to redeemed. He can take you from hopeless to sure of your eternity. And as Christians, we need to lean on God, knowing that he's there for us and he cares for us. And when we struggle and when we have need, he hears us. What a great advantage it has that he gives us not only himself, but his people. That there are those who will be there with us. Just as Naomi wasn't alone, there was a good man, Boaz, who was willing to help her, to help Ruth. There are brothers and sisters in Christ who will help you in your struggles. They'll pray for you. They'll be there for you. All you have to do is make that step. Naomi decided to leave Moab and come home. The prodigal son decided to leave the far country and go back to the Father. Today you can decide to leave a life of sin and go back to your Father who loves you and cares for you. He's not far from us. If we'll just reach out, he'll be there for us. Tonight, if you need to respond to the invitation of Jesus Christ, we offer you an opportunity to do so right now while we stand and sing.